The pouch of gold coins hit the table with a sound that made Alara flinch. "Take it," Lord Varron said, his smile sharp as a blade. "Take it, and forget what you saw in the East Corridor last night. Forget the conversation. Forget the names. Forget everything." Ilara stared at the leather pouch. More gold than she'd earn in 10 years of scrubbing floors and carrying linens. Enough to leave the castle, start fresh somewhere far away. Enough to matter. But the weight of what she'd witnessed pressed heavier than any coin. She was nobody. A chambermaid with no family, no protector, no voice that anyone would believe. Orphaned at 7 when fever swept through the lower villages, she'd grown up in the castle's service quarters, invisible to the nobles who walked these halls. 22 years of life, and she'd learned one lesson above all others. People like her didn't survive by being brave. They survived by being silent. Lord Varron leaned closer, and she caught the sour scent of wine on his breath. "You're a clever girl, aren't you? Clever enough to know what happens to servants who speak out of turn?" She knew. Everyone knew. Servants who caused problems simply disappeared, reassigned to distant estates, they said. But Ilara had been here long enough to know that reassigned often meant something far more permanent. "My lord," she whispered, "I don't understand what you think I—" "Don't." His hand slammed down beside the gold, making her jump. "Don't insult us both. You were there. I saw your shadow. And now you have a choice." He pushed the pouch toward her. "Take the gold, live comfortably, or refuse and discover how uncomfortable life can become for a girl with no one to miss her." Her hands trembled as she reached for the coins. What choice did she have? She was one person against a conspiracy that reached into the highest ranks of the court. Lord Varron and his allies were planning something that involved the Lycan king, something spoken of in whispers about accidents and succession. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough to know it was treason, and treason was not her burden to bear. Her fingers closed around the leather. "Wise choice," Lord Varron said. "Now get out, and remember." The door burst open. Ilara had never seen the Lycan king up close. She'd glimpsed him at a distance during court functions, a tall figure on a throne, dark-haired and imposing, surrounded by guards and advisors. The servants whispered about him constantly. 300 years old, unmarried, cold as winter stone. They said he could smell lies, sense fear, hear a heartbeat from across a room. Now he stood in the doorway, and every whisper she'd ever heard fell utterly short of the reality. He was enormous, not just tall, but broad, filling the frame with shoulders that seemed carved from granite. His dark hair fell past his jaw, and his eyes— gods, his eyes were the amber of a wolf's, bright and piercing and fixed directly on Lord Varron, with an intensity that made the nobleman stumble backward. "Your Majesty," Varron stammered. "I didn't expect— we were just— I know exactly what you were doing." The king's voice was low, a rumble that Ilara felt in her chest. He stepped into the room, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier. "I've known for 3 days, Varron. Did you think I wouldn't notice the whispers, the secret meetings, the sudden nervousness of my most trusted lords?" Varron's face went white. "Sire, I can explain—" "You'll explain everything. In the dungeons. My guards are waiting outside." The king's gaze didn't waver. "You have 5 seconds to walk out of this room with dignity, or I'll drag you out without it." Varron ran. The door slammed behind him, and then there was silence. Silence and the Lycan king, who still hadn't looked at her, who stood motionless, as if listening to sounds beyond her hearing. Ilara realized she'd stopped breathing. The gold was still clutched in her hands, damning evidence of her almost betrayal. Slowly the king turned. His eyes found hers, and something shifted in his expression. The cold fury that had driven Varenne from the room flickered, replaced by something else. Something she couldn't name. His nostrils flared slightly, and she saw his hands clench at his sides. "You," he said softly. "What's your name?" Ilara, Your Majesty." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm a chambermaid. I work in the East Wing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to—" "Stop." He held up one hand, and her words died in her throat. "You're terrified." It wasn't a question. Of course she was terrified. She'd just witnessed his controlled rage, watched a powerful lord flee like a frightened child. She was holding bribe money in her hands. She had every reason to expect punishment. But the king didn't move toward her with violence. Instead, he crossed to the table, pulled out the chair opposite hers, and sat down. The simple act of him sitting, putting himself at her level, choosing to be less imposing, startled her so much that she forgot to be afraid for a moment. "The gold," he said. "Who gave it to you?" "Lord Varenne, Your Majesty, just now." "Why?" Her mouth went dry. I saw something, heard something. Last night, in the East Corridor. Lord Varenne and two others. They were talking about—" She couldn't say it. The words felt too dangerous even now. "About killing me," the king finished calmly. "Yes. I'm aware." She stared at him. "You knew?" "I've known about the conspiracy for some time. I've been waiting to see who else was involved before I acted." His amber eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she found she couldn't. "What I didn't know was that they'd approached you, that they'd tried to buy your silence." "I was going to take it," she admitted, shame burning in her chest. "I was going to take the gold and say nothing. I'm sorry. I know it was wrong. But I was scared, and I'm nobody. And who would have believed me anyway? And dash. Ilara." Her name in his voice stopped her rambling. "You were alone, powerless, and threatened by men who could destroy you with a word. Fear is not a sin." She blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected him to say. "But," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "you were still holding the gold when I walked in? You hadn't left. You hadn't agreed." His head tilted, wolf-like. "Why?" She didn't have an answer. Or rather, she had one, but it sounded foolish even in her own mind, because it was wrong. Because even if no one would believe her, she would know. Because some part of her, the part that had survived 22 years of being invisible, had whispered that she couldn't live with the weight of a king's death on her conscience. The king watched her struggle for words, and slowly, something like a smile touched his mouth. "Who tried to buy you, little chambermaid?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "Tell me everything. And I promise you, whatever happens next, you will not face it alone." She told him everything. The words spilled out of her like water from a cracked vessel. The late-night errand that had taken her through the East Corridor, the voices she'd heard behind the half-open door, the names spoken in hushed tones. Lord Varenne, Lord Castellan, Lady Moira, and a fourth voice she hadn't recognized, someone who spoke of poison and timing and the upcoming hunt where accidents happen so easily in the forest. The king listened without interrupting. His amber eyes never left her face, and she found herself talking longer than she'd intended, filling the silence with details she hadn't even realized she'd remembered. The way Lord Varen had laughed when someone suggested the deed might weigh on their conscience. The cold certainty in Lady Moira's voice when she'd said, "He's ruled long enough. It's time for change." When Ilara finally stopped, her throat raw, the king was quiet for a long moment. "You remembered all of that," he said. "Every detail, every name." "I have a good memory, Your Majesty." She looked down at her hands. "It's the only thing I have that's worth anything." "That's not true." She glanced up, startled by the certainty in his voice. "You have courage," he said. "You have integrity. You were terrified, and you still hesitated to take the bribe. Those aren't small things, Ilara. Those are rare things." No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever suggested she had value beyond her ability to scrub floors and carry linens. She didn't know what to do with his words, so she did what she always did when she didn't understand something. She stayed silent. The king rose from his chair, and for a moment she thought the conversation was over, that he would dismiss her back to her duties, and she would never see him again. Instead, he walked to the door and spoke quietly to someone outside. When he returned, he didn't sit back down. He stood by the window, his broad back to her, looking out at the courtyard below. "You can't go back to your quarters," he said. "Varen's allies don't know yet that he's been arrested. When they find out, they'll look for anyone who might have talked, anyone who might be a witness." Fear coiled in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're in danger." He turned to face her. "I'm having rooms prepared for you in the royal wing. You'll stay there until this is resolved." "The royal wing?" She nearly choked on the words. "Your Majesty, I can't. That's not. I'm a servant. I can't stay in the royal wing." "You can, and you will." His tone left no room for argument. "I'm also assigning guards to you, 2 at all times. They'll escort you wherever you need to go." Guards? For me? This was absurd. This was impossible. Things like this didn't happen to girls like her. "Your Majesty, surely that's not necessary. I'm nobody. I'm not important enough to—" "Stop saying that." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch, and something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, at startling her. "Stop saying you're nobody," he repeated, softer now. "Stop saying you're not important. You witnessed a conspiracy against the crown. You refused a bribe. You told me the truth when lying would have been safer. That makes you important. That makes you someone worth protecting." She didn't know what to say. She'd spent her entire life learning to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to never expect anything from anyone. And now the Lycan King himself was telling her she mattered. It felt like a trap. It had to be a trap. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The king went very still. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and she saw something shift in his amber eyes, something deep and ancient and almost hungry. "Because," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care, "when I walked into that room and saw you sitting there, holding that gold with shaking hands and tears in your eyes, something in me recognized something in you. I can't explain it better than that. Not yet." Recognition. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning she didn't understand. A knock at the door interrupted whatever he might have said next. A servant entered. Not a chambermaid like Ilara, but someone in finer livery, someone who clearly served the royal household directly. "The rooms are ready, Your Majesty." Good. The king nodded toward Ilara. This is Ilara. She's to be treated as an honored guest. Whatever she needs, she receives. Is that clear? Yes, Your Majesty. And just like that, her life changed. The rooms were larger than the entire servants' quarters where she'd lived for 15 years. A sitting room with velvet chairs and a fireplace already crackling with warmth. A bedroom with a bed so large she could stretch out in any direction and not touch the edges. A private bathing chamber with hot water that came from pipes in the wall. She'd heard of such things, but never imagined she'd use them herself. Clean clothes had been laid out for her. Not a servant's rough-spun dress, but a gown of soft blue wool with embroidery at the cuffs. When she touched it, she almost cried. A meal arrived shortly after. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables in butter sauce, and a small cake with honey glaze. More food than she usually ate in 3 days. She sat at the small table by the window and ate slowly, savouring every bite, half convinced she would wake up at any moment and find herself back in her narrow cot in the servants' quarters. She didn't wake up. As the sun set and the room filled with golden light, there was another knock at her door. She opened it to find the king standing there, changed now from his formal court clothes into something simpler, a dark tunic and trousers that somehow made him look more human, more approachable. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped back wordlessly, and he entered. He looked around the room, checking something. The fire, the food, the clothes, making sure she had everything she needed. "Is it acceptable?" he asked. "The rooms?" "Acceptable." She let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your Majesty, these rooms are nicer than anything I've ever seen in my life. I don't know how to... I can't possibly repay." "There's nothing to repay." He turned to face her, and his expression was serious. "Ilara, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I expect something from you. I'm not doing this to put you in my debt. I'm doing this because it's right. Because you deserve safety and comfort and kindness. Because someone should have given you these things a long time ago." Her eyes burned. She blinked rapidly, refusing to cry in front of him. "I don't understand you," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life learning how the world works. People don't give things away for free. There's always a price. There's always a catch. There's no catch. There has to be." He smiled then, a real smile that softened the hard planes of his face and made him look almost gentle. "You've had a difficult life, haven't you? No one to trust, no one to rely on." "I learned early that relying on people only leads to disappointment." "Who taught you that?" She hesitated. No one ever asked about her past. No one ever cared enough to wonder. "My parents died when I was 7, she said quietly. "After that, I was alone. The castle took me in as a servant, and I learned quickly that kindness was rare and usually came with strings attached. So I stopped expecting it. I stopped hoping for it." The king was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I'm going to prove you wrong," he said softly. "I'm going to show you that kindness can exist without strings, that protection can be given freely, that you deserve good things simply because you exist." He reached out and very gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Will you let me try?" Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. Every instinct she had screamed at her to refuse, to protect herself, to not let anyone close enough to hurt her. But something else, something small and fragile and hopeful, whispered, "What if he means it?" "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. I don't know how to trust someone. Then we'll learn together, he said, one day at a time. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. And when he left her rooms that night, she stood by the window and watched the stars appear one by one, and for the first time in 15 years, she let herself feel something that might have been hope. The nightmare came 3 nights later. Ilara woke gasping, tangled in sheets softer than anything she'd ever slept on, her heart racing and her skin slick with sweat. The dream was already fading, fragments of fire and screaming and her mother's face disappearing into smoke. But the terror lingered, sharp and cold in her chest. She sat up, pressing her hands to her face, trying to slow her breathing. It had been years since she'd dreamed of the fever that had taken her parents, years since she'd let herself remember those final days. Her father's cough that wouldn't stop, her mother's skin burning hot to the touch, the way they'd both looked at her with such desperate love before the light left their eyes. A knock at the door made her jump. "Ilara?" The king's voice, low and concerned. "I heard. Are you all right?" She stared at the door. It was the middle of the night. What was he doing here? How had he heard anything through stone walls and heavy oak? Then she remembered. Lycan hearing. He could probably hear her heartbeat from across the castle. "I'm fine," she called, her voice rough. "Just a dream. I'm sorry if I disturbed." "You didn't disturb me. May I come in?" She looked down at herself. The nightgown they'd given her was modest enough. Long sleeves, high neck, soft white cotton. But still, it was the middle of the night, and she was in her bedclothes, and he was the king. "Yes," she said anyway, because she didn't want to be alone. He entered quietly, closing the door behind him. He was dressed simply, loose trousers, a shirt half unlaced at the throat, his dark hair slightly mussed. She realized with a start that she'd woken him, that the king of the realm had gotten out of bed because he'd heard her cry out in her sleep. "The fire's gone out," he said, crossing to the hearth. "You're shivering." She hadn't noticed, but now that he mentioned it, she could feel the cold seeping into her bones, mixing with the lingering chill of the nightmare. She watched as he knelt before the fireplace and coaxed the embers back to life with practiced ease. The flames caught, casting warm light across his profile. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly. "It was just a bad dream." "What were you dreaming about?" The question was gentle, not demanding. She could refuse to answer. She could tell him it was nothing, just stress, just her mind playing tricks. He would probably accept that and leave her be. But she was so tired of being alone with her memories. "My parents," she said. "The day they died." He didn't respond immediately. He finished with the fire, then rose and pulled one of the velvet chairs closer to her bed before sitting down. Not on the bed itself, maintaining that careful distance he always kept, but close enough that she could see his face clearly in the firelight. "Tell me," he said. "You don't want to hear about that." "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't want to know." He leaned back in the chair, his amber eyes steady on hers. "Tell me about them. Your parents." So she did. She told him about her father, a carpenter who made furniture for the village and sometimes for the castle itself. How his hands had been rough with calluses, but gentle when he lifted her onto his shoulders. How he used to sing off-key while he worked, terrible songs that made her mother laugh and cover her ears. She told him about her mother, who had grown herbs in a small garden behind their cottage and knew remedies for every ailment. How she'd brushed Ilara's hair every night before bed. 100 strokes, counting softly. How she'd smelled like lavender and fresh bread. She told him about the fever that had swept through their village in the winter of her 7th year. How quickly it had spread. How her parents had both fallen ill within days of each other. How she'd tried to take care of them with what little she knew, bringing them water and pressing cool cloths to their foreheads and begging them not to leave her. "I was with them when they died," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "First my father, then my mother 2 days later. She held my hand until the very end. Her last words were, 'Be brave, little one. Be brave.'" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've never been brave. Not once in my life." "That's not true." She looked up to find the king watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Something soft. Something almost like pain. "You've been brave every single day," he said. "Surviving alone, with no one to protect you, no one to care for you. That takes courage. Waking up each morning and choosing to keep going when the world has given you every reason to give up. That's the bravest thing there is." "That's not bravery. That's just existing." "No." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving hers. "Existing would be letting yourself become hard, letting yourself become cruel. You've been alone for 15 years, Alara, and you're still kind. You still have a heart that feels things deeply. You still hesitated to take a bribe even when you were terrified." He shook his head slowly. "You have no idea how rare that is. How precious." Precious. The word wrapped around her like a warm blanket. No one had ever called her precious before. "I don't feel precious," she admitted. "I feel broken, like there are pieces of me missing that I'll never get back." The king rose from his chair. For a moment, she thought he was leaving, and her heart clenched with unexpected disappointment. But instead, he crossed to the bed and sat on its edge, close enough now that she could see the individual flecks of gold in his amber eyes. "You're not broken," he said softly. "You're scarred. There's a difference. Broken things fall apart. Scarred things have survived." He reached out, and his fingers brushed her cheek, feather-light, impossibly gentle for hands that could crush stone. "You're a survivor, Ilara, and survivors aren't broken. They're the strongest people there are." Her breath caught in her throat. He was so close, so warm. His touch on her skin sent sparks cascading through her body, and she found herself leaning into his hand without meaning to. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "Why do you keep coming here, checking on me, saying these things? I'm just a chambermaid. I'm nobody special." "Stop saying that." His voice was rough now, almost strained. "You are special. You've been special since the moment I first saw you. I told you, something in me recognized something in you. And every moment I spend with you, every conversation we have, only confirms what I already knew." "What did you know?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, his thumb traced gently across her cheekbone, and he looked at her with such naked longing that it stole her breath. "Ask me again someday," he murmured, "when you're ready to hear the answer." Then he pulled back, and the loss of his touch left her feeling cold despite the fire. "You should sleep," he said, rising from the bed. "I'll stay until you do if you'd like, in case the nightmares come back." "You don't have to." "I want to." 3 simple words, but they meant everything. He returned to the chair by the fire, and she lay back against her pillows, watching him through half-closed eyes. The flames painted shadows across his face, softening the harsh lines, making him look almost gentle, making him look like someone she could trust, making him look like someone she could love. The thought terrified her. Love was dangerous. Love was loss. Love was her parents' graves in a village she'd never returned to, two mounds of earth that marked everything she'd ever lost. But as her eyes grew heavy and sleep began to pull her under, she found she couldn't quite convince herself to stop hoping. He was still there when she drifted off, and somehow that made all the difference. The trials ended on a grey morning, 2 weeks after Ilara's world had turned upside down. She'd been asked to testify, to stand before the assembled court and recount what she'd heard in the East Corridor. The thought had terrified her. Speaking in front of nobles, lords, and ladies who had never once looked at her when she'd been a servant, who would now be forced to see her as a witness against their peers. But the king had stood beside her the entire time, not touching her, not speaking for her, but present. A silent wall of support that never wavered. And when Lord Varen had sneered at her from the prisoner's dock, "You believe this little nothing? This chambermaid, who was ready to take my gold and disappear?" The king's growl had silenced the entire hall. "She refused your gold," he'd said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "She told me the truth when lying would have been safer. That makes her worth more than every noble in this room combined." Now the conspirators were gone, executed for treason, their lands and titles stripped, their names erased from the rolls of honor. The threat was over. The king was safe. And Ilara had no idea what came next. She was sitting by the window in her borrowed rooms, watching rain streak down the glass when he came to find her. He knocked, as he always did, and waited for her permission before entering. Such a small thing, that courtesy. Such a small thing that meant everything. "It's done," he said, closing the door behind him. "The last of their allies have been dealt with. You're safe now." "I know." She turned from the window to face him. "The servants have been talking about nothing else all morning." He crossed the room, but stopped several feet away from her, maintaining that careful distance he'd kept since the night he'd stayed through her nightmare. As if he was afraid of coming too close. As if he was holding himself back. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "Something I should have told you from the beginning." Her heart stuttered. "What is it?" For a long moment he didn't speak. He just looked at her, really looked at her, with those amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Do you know what a mate bond is?" he asked finally. She shook her head. She'd heard the term whispered among servants, Lycan business, they called it, nothing to do with humans like her, but she'd never understood what it meant. "Lycans don't choose who we love," he said. "Not the way humans do. When we meet our fated mate, the one person in all the world who was made for us, we know instantly. We feel it in our blood, our bones, our very souls. It's like finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing." Ilara's breath caught. She thought of his words that first day. "Something in me recognized something in you." "When I walked into that room and saw you," he continued, his voice rough, "I knew, before you spoke a single word, before I even learned your name. I knew you were mine." The word hung in the air between them. Mine. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because you were terrified. Because you'd just been threatened by men who wanted to use you. Because you had no reason to trust anyone, least of all a Lycan king who wanted to claim you." He took a step closer, then stopped himself. "I didn't want you to feel trapped. I didn't want you to think you had no choice." "Do I?" The question came out barely audible. "Have a choice?" Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or fear. She'd never seen him look afraid before. "Yes," he said. "You have a choice. That's why I'm telling you now." He took a deep breath. "The danger is over. You can go back to your old life if you want. I'll give you money, protection, a cottage in whatever village you choose. You'll never want for anything. And I'll never bother you again." Her heart clenched. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "No." The word was torn from him. "No, that's the last thing I want. I want you to stay. I want you to be my queen, my partner, my everything. I want to spend the rest of my very long life making you happy." His hands clenched at his sides. "But I won't force you. I won't trap you. You've spent your whole life with no power, no choices, no voice. I won't be another person who takes those things from you." Ilara stared at him, this powerful, ancient, terrifying king, and he was giving her the choice. He was putting his heart in her hands and telling her she could walk away. She thought about her old life. The narrow cot in the servants' quarters, the endless days of scrubbing and carrying and being invisible, the loneliness that had become so familiar she'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to hurt. She thought about the past 2 weeks, the way he looked at her like she mattered, the way he listened when she spoke, the way he'd held her through nightmares and called her precious and told her she wasn't broken. She thought about love, about loss, about her mother's last words. "Be brave, little one." "What if I'm not enough?" The words spilled out before she could stop them. "What if you realize I'm just a chambermaid, just a nobody, and you regret?" "Ilara." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, and suddenly he was right there, close enough to touch. "You are not nobody. You are the bravest, kindest, most resilient person I have ever met. You are exactly what I have been waiting 300 years to find." His hands came up to cup her face, gentle despite their strength. "You are my mate, my treasure. And if you'll have me, I will spend every day of eternity proving that you are worthy of love." She was crying. She didn't know when she'd started, but tears were streaming down her face, and she couldn't seem to stop them. "I don't know how to be a queen," she said. "I don't know how to be anything but a servant." "Then we'll learn together." His thumbs brushed away her tears. "I'll teach you whatever you want to know, and you'll teach me how to be worthy of you." "You're already worthy of me." The words came out without thought, without planning, just pure, raw truth. His breath caught. "Ilara, I choose you?" She reached up and covered his hands with hers. "I choose you. I choose this. I choose to stay." For one heartbeat, he was perfectly still. Then he made a sound, something between a growl and a groan, and his mouth came down on hers. The kiss was everything she'd never known she wanted. Fierce and tender, demanding and giving. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him, and she melted into his warmth like she'd been cold her entire life and was only now discovering what it meant to be held. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Mine," he said. The word a vow and a promise and a prayer all at once. "You're mine, Ilara, and I'm yours, for as long as you'll have me." "Forever," she whispered. "I'll have you forever." He kissed her again, softer this time, like she was something precious he was afraid to break. And she kissed him back with everything she had. All the hope she'd been afraid to feel, all the love she'd been afraid to give, all the bravery she'd never believed she possessed. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, wrapped in the arms of the man who had seen her when no one else had, Ilara felt like the sun had finally come out. The wedding took place on the first day of spring. Ilara stood before the mirror in her chambers now, not borrowed rooms, but a queen's suite adjoining the king's own, and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The gown was ivory silk, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like stars. Her hair had been woven with small white flowers, and around her throat hung a delicate chain bearing a single amber stone. A gift from Caden, who had pressed it into her hands that morning with a kiss and a whispered, "So you'll always carry a piece of me with you." Caden. She still sometimes couldn't believe she was allowed to call him that. The fearsome Lycan king, terror of his enemies, ruler of a realm, and he looked at her like she had hung the moon. A knock at the door. "Your Majesty?" "It's time." "Your Majesty." 2 months, and she still wasn't used to the title. She suspected she never would be. The great hall was filled to bursting. Every noble in the realm had come to witness the impossible. A chambermaid becoming queen. Ilara could feel their eyes on her as she walked down the aisle, could hear the whispers that followed in her wake. Some curious, some disapproving, some outright hostile. She didn't care. Because at the end of the aisle stood Caden, and the look on his face when he saw her made every whisper, every stare, every moment of doubt worth it. "You're beautiful," he breathed as she reached him. "You're biased." Completely. He took her hands in his, and his amber eyes were bright with something that looked almost like tears. "I'm also correct." The ceremony was traditional. Ancient Lycan vows spoken in the old tongue, the binding of hands with a silver cord, the exchange of blood that would tie their souls together for eternity. Ilara had studied the words for weeks, terrified of making a mistake, of embarrassing herself in front of the entire court. But when the moment came, the words flowed from her lips like she'd known them all her life. And when Caden spoke his vows, promising to protect her, cherish her, love her until the stars burned out, she felt the truth of them settle into her bones. "I now declare you bound," the officiant announced. "One soul in 2 bodies, from now until forever." Caden kissed her, and the hall erupted in cheers. The feast that followed was the most extravagant Ilara had ever seen. She sat at the high table, Caden's hand never leaving hers, and watched as nobles approached to pay their respects. Most were polite, if distant. Some were genuinely warm. And then Lady Harriet approached. Ilara recognized her instantly. She'd been head of the household staff when Ilara was a chambermaid, a cold, cruel woman who had taken pleasure in assigning Ilara the worst tasks, who had called her stupid and useless and worthless more times than she could count. Now, Lady Harriet stood before the high table, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she performed a deep curtsy. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice strained, "may I offer my congratulations on your marriage?" Ilara looked at her for a long moment. She could feel Caden's tension beside her, could sense his wolf ready to rise in her defense at the slightest provocation. But she didn't need defending. Not anymore. "Thank you, Lady Harriet," she said calmly. "I remember you well from my time in the servants' quarters. You taught me many things." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Primarily what kind of person I never wanted to become." Lady Harriet's face went red, then white. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and finally retreated without another word. Caden squeezed her hand under the table. That was magnificent. Was it too much? It was perfect. He leaned close, his lips brushing her ear. Have I mentioned that I love you? The words still made her heart skip. You might have mentioned it once or twice. I love you, he said again, louder this time, not caring who heard. I love you, Ilara, my queen, my mate, my heart. I love you too, she whispered back. More than I ever thought I was capable of loving anyone. The feast continued late into the night, but eventually, finally, they were alone. Their chambers were warm with firelight, and Caden held her like she was the most precious thing in all the world. And when he loved her, gently, reverently, with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, she finally understood what it meant to be cherished. Afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled of him, Ilara traced idle patterns on his chest and marveled at how much had changed. What are you thinking? He asked, his voice a low rumble. That 3 months ago I was scrubbing floors and praying to be invisible, and now I'm here, with you. She shook her head. It doesn't feel real sometimes. It's real. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. This is your life now, our life, and I'm going to spend every day making sure you never doubt that you deserve it. 1 year later, Ilara stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, watching the sun rise over a kingdom that had become her home. So much had changed. She had learned to read. Caden had taught her himself, patient and proud when she mastered each new word. She had learned the names of every servant in the castle and made sure they were treated with kindness. She had established a home for orphaned children in the village where she'd grown up, a place where no child would ever have to feel as alone as she had. And in her arms, wrapped in soft blankets and sleeping peacefully, was their daughter. 3 months old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's stubborn chin. They had named her Hope. Caden appeared behind her, his arms wrapping around them both. You're up early? Couldn't sleep. She leaned back into his warmth. I was thinking about my mother. What about her? Her last words to me. Be brave, little one. Ilara smiled, blinking back tears. I think she'd be proud of me. I think she'd be happy to know that I finally learned how. She would be proud, Caden said softly. I know I am. They stood there together as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. A king and his queen. A family built from pain and hope and love. Ilara had spent 22 years believing she was nobody, believing she was worthless, believing that good things happen to other people, never to girls like her. She had been wrong. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the one someone has been searching for. Sometimes the woman offered gold to stay silent is the same woman brave enough to speak the truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, the chambermaid becomes the queen. Not because she was chosen, but because she chose. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale of love, fate, and second chances. Until next time.